And we are now live.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. We will get started right at the top of the hour in about 4 minutes. Thanks to those participants who are joining us a few minutes in advance. We will get started at the top of the hour. I'm watching the clock as avidly as if it's New Year's Eve, and I'm waiting for the stroke of midnight. We'll get started at the top of the hour, maybe a minute or two after, to give everybody a chance to join. I suspect we are having some folks encounter the need to download Ring Central. So we will give them another 90 seconds or so of grace because our technology is not, it's not what everyone expects. And if folks want to follow the example of Benita Green from Durham and introduce themselves in the chat, we welcome you to do that. Thanks, Benita, for saying hello and letting us know you're out there. Great. Okay, let's go ahead and get started because we have such a rich conversation ahead. I don't want to cut any of it short. Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm really glad you're here and I appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'm Jennifer Bradley and I'm a senior fellow with the Kresge Foundation's American Cities program, and I'll be serving as today's moderator. This webinar is the first in a series exploring how the unprecedented flow of federal funds into cities can be used to advance equity, center community voice, wisdom, and priorities, and move away from the status quo towards truly transformative investments. You can learn more about this series by going to sharedprosperity.org. During today's webinar, we'll hear from Lourdes German, an expert on municipal finance, speaking about how cities are starting to use their ARPA dollars. Lourdes is a senior advisor to the Kresge Foundation, so I'm lucky to call her a colleague, and is also on the faculty of the Harvard Graduate School of Design teaching public finance. After Lourdes' presentation, we will have a panel discussion with Ashley Swearengin from the Central Valley Community Foundation, Georgeanne White from the City of Fresno, and Jerry Yang Johnson of Wells Fargo. Before we get started, here are a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and shared online in the coming days, and we'll also follow up by sending you a link. As you've probably figured out, participants will be in the listen-only mode during the duration of the webinar. We have built in a lot of time in today's agenda to answer questions following the presentation and the panel discussion, and we invite you to share your questions through the Q&A function at any time during the presentation or the panel discussion. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. It's just a trade-off, right? If we can see your questions in writing, it's more likely that we can get to more rather than going through the mute, unmute. So we do want your participation. This is just the best way for us to manage it, given the technology. So with that, I will turn things over to Lourdes.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer, for this invitation and all of you for joining us today. If we can go to the next slide, I believe I'll show you a little bit of what my presentation will cover. The next slide. Thank you. And part of what we're going to do today is first make sure that we have a shared understanding of what is in the American Rescue Plan. We all know that when the ARPA was signed into law on March 11th, it provided a level of unprecedented support and investment that we had not seen in literally a generation for people and leaders of communities to really consider how to meet not just the urgent and complex interconnected factors and challenges arising under COVID-19, but also to really lay the groundwork for a sustained recovery that was inclusive and included and elevated values of equity. So today I'm going to start with a brief overview of why the ARPA is so transformative, and then going to delve into what are we seeing at the 6-month mark? What are we seeing communities actually do from a spending standpoint, based on a representative sample of cities that we examined for this webinar, and then really turn to saying what are some of the high impact strategies and key considerations that could be valuable to you as both either a leader of a city or a leader of an organization or stakeholder who is seeking to work with communities to really leverage this transformative opportunity. And then I'm going to end with some closing reflections so that we lead into our wonderful panel. If we can go to the next slide. I'll start with that brief overview. So all of us know that the 1.85 trillion of aid is monumental, and it's significant, not just in size and scale, but because it's distributed not just to governments, but also citizens directly, nonprofits, CDFIs, and a whole range of stakeholders that we know are integral to the success of cities and communities. The funding is time limited. We all know that it will sunset in 2024, even though there are parts of the ARPA that will allow expenditure through 2026 where there have been certain committed obligations. And I want to elevate a couple of key distinctions that really distinguish the ARPA from its predecessor relief packages. First, we see the encouragement and enablement of transformative investments in program services and certain classes of infrastructure with an equity lens, as I mentioned before. Second, this is the first piece of relief that authorizes revenue loss replacement. So where communities have been hardest hit and their budgets have really struggled in that entry in the period, sort of in the beginning of COVID, this allows a way to plug that gap. And that's going to become meaningful in some of the comments I'm going to hearken to later and trends that we're seeing. And another unique feature is from a compliance and reporting standpoint, Treasury is not just asking communities to say, did you spend the money, and really focus on expenditure-based reporting. There is a focus on outcomes and really elevating what is happening with the money at a national level, at a local level, such that we really look back and see, did this enable a different kind of sustained investment in areas of equity, equality, and inclusive communities than other relief packages. And I will note that even though we have legislation that is fully passed, a key point to keep in mind is that we are still in what's called the interim final rule phase. That means that there's not a final rule around implementation. And that's going to be significant, particularly when we say, how are cities actually spending the money right now versus what could change in the next couple of months. On the next slide, you'll see just a really brief diagram developed by Drexel University that reminds us of all the functional categories of expenditure. So when we say, where does this money go? This is a really neat allocation that shows you both, to children, youth and families, transportation, individual relief, and other categories. On the next slide, you'll see the sources that we reviewed in the analysis that I'm going to present shortly. And it includes both recent reports the Treasury released in the last 2 weeks. So there are 2 significant reports on how equity was being centered into the American Rescue Plan, and a second report where Treasury did their own 6-month assessment of impact and said, these are the projects, and these are some of the national trends that we are most proud of. Separately from that, I reviewed what are called recovery plan reports. Here you're seeing an example of Detroit's for cities that had a population of over 250,000, and on the aggregate had about 9.8 billion of allocations awarded under ARPA. And that's about 20% of the 45 billion to what are called metropolitan cities. So you see that the sample was really representative of not all cities in America, but a good portion of them, and spanned across 20 states representing all geographic regions. So if we go to the first slide, I'll tell you the first question I asked myself: are cities actually spending the money when we look at this 6-month juncture? And to make sure that we answer that question, understanding the complexity of how cities spend money, you want to be aware of 3 things. So obviously, when you plan to spend money as a government, you usually go through, and this is an oversimplification, an allocations process. You decide just what are the priorities. Second, you have to probably get some legal authorization. You have to do some type of appropriation. Maybe you go to your city council to say, now that we know what we want to spend money on, let's actually earmark that expenditure for, again, to be very simple about it. And then finally, once you cross through those and other steps, you actually get to the expenditure process when you can actually spend the money in alignment with those prior steps. On the next the next slide, you'll see a chart that shows you how only 3% of the cities that I examined have actually spent all of their ARP money. This was not surprising to me, and I'll explain why as we go through some deeper remarks. The majority of cities, roughly about 58%, have spent some of the money, not all, and have some allocation plan in place. So they've identified some priorities, they've begun to develop a spending plan, but they certainly haven't spent all the money. 39% do not have a spending plan. So they have not made any allocations, they've not identified any projects. This is telling for a few reasons. So at the start, I reiterated, we still don't have a final rule. Think about being a leader in government and having to really address how you will spend this transformative opportunity absent that guidance. It's not an indictment, but it's a kind of a snapshot of the reality of this moment in time in government decision making. Second, funds are dispersed in tranches. So we know that some communities, particularly the ones that we're focusing on in this analysis, received half of the money up front, but are expecting a significant half in May of 22 of their ARPA disbursement. A key takeaway that this kind of expenditure variation tells me is that there is still an opportunity to shape strategy because guidance is still forthcoming in very significant areas. And no city that you work with should feel an indictment by not having an expenditure plan. It's perfectly normal given the context of how aid is unfolding. And one of the key things that we're going to also talk about is where cities are actually showing high degrees of spending, what are they spending money on? Because as you know, ARPA provides a range of expenditure patterns, some of which are clearer than others. If you look on the next slide, you'll see a little bit more context where with the same categories of spending that I just outlined in the pie chart, 3 cities that are emblematic and that I came across to represent some of the predominant trends of why their spending patterns are as they are. The city of Charlotte, North Carolina is an example of a community that, as their report said, had no spending plan in place. Now, the reason, they very thoughtfully articulated that they need additional time for deliberation. The complexity of the rule is hard. And absent guidance, it is hard to hearken to innovative strategies, particularly where you want to think about, a corridor initiative that includes opportunity for all and ties to larger equity-wide priorities for the city, but has uses that, where they're not clear cut within the Treasury guidance that we have today. And in addition to that, you want to engage in deeper public deliberations processes. The city of Detroit stands as an example of a community that had allocations, but minimal spending. The only spending that they have done is on administrative items. Why? The majority of time in Detroit was really focused on a very deliberative and robust public engagement process, one of the most robust public engagement processes cities has ever engaged in. Treasury actually lifted up Detroit for this reason. And one of the key trends that this harkens to is the fact that community engagement is becoming all the more prominent because it was actually called out by Treasury as a value that cities had to report on. One of the cities at the end of the spectrum that you see is Anaheim. So they've spent all the money, their full allocation. Why? They spent it on one category, revenue loss replacement. And this is because the city experienced 185 million in revenue losses prior to COVID. That's significant because when they had to think about a very clear priority that was blessed by Treasury within the rules and also their own expenditure and budgetary framework, this priority clearly rose to the top as one that was defensible and appropriate in view of their strategy as they reported in their plan to Treasury. And one of the things that I noticed in reviewing all of the data is that a lot of cities with a high degree of expenditures were devoting a lot of their ARPA allocations to revenue loss replacement. And I want to underscore again that what you're seeing are what I really believe are normal variabilities in spending patterns given the context of this legislation and what we know about ARPA at this time. And particularly where you see that not all cities stepped into COVID with the same fiscal base and same challenges. Some had deep structural imbalances and others that really required a lens on priorities that's going to be different than a community that is in a more generative and resource-rich position. If you look on the next slide, you'll see another trend of once we look at cities that have some spending plans, some allocations in place, what are they spending the money on? And this shows you across all of the actual functional categories that the U.S. Treasury has identified and set out for reporting. The largest category was revenue replacement. Second to that, programs to address the negative economic impact of COVID and infrastructure spending across water, sewer, and broadband, the eligible purposes. And all of those 3 categories outpace spending on public health. One of the key things you want to think about as you look at a chart like this as a leader is, well, what does this tell me about the high impact project across all of these areas? And second, how do I know that my high impact project is also calibrated, right, to the cross-jurisdictional frame of this act? Because again, we've been talking about cities, but we all know that states and counties are also receiving funds. And how do you know that your high impact strategy, when situated in that larger frame in the jurisdiction that you're nestled in, will make sense? And that's an even harder question. So to have some guidance around that, if we go to the next slide, the US Treasury has started reporting on what they believe are the high impact strategies across America with first a cross jurisdictional lens. Examples that have been elevated include the ones you see here: Harris County, Washington, D.C., and the state of Kentucky. So Harris County and leveraging ARP funds for vaccination and clearly addressing a critical need that we all know is integral to both the return to work, the return to children in schools, the return to some sense of normalcy in the kind of consumption and economic patterns that we all enjoy. Second example, Washington, D.C. and affordable housing, elevated by Treasury, particularly as we see the landscape around eviction and homelessness and understanding the importance of housing obviously to racial wealth gaps and inequities that have predominantly impacted not just all populations, but also communities of color facing housing insecurity. Third example elevated by Treasury is the state of Kentucky and their infrastructure investments targeting water and sewer, essential purposes that we know are absolutely critical when we think about social determinants of health and outcomes that we've seen be really material under COVID. And also understanding that they weren't just framing a strategy of saying we're investing in the brick and mortar, but that their strategy was really coupled with a focus on labor market participation, as we've seen how important labor patterns are becoming under COVID. So beyond the examples that Treasury has put forward, saying these are where we believe we're seeing the potential for high impact, there are a couple of trends that I noticed just within cities that I think represent really interesting and striking peer examples. If you look at the next slide, you'll see the first of three that I'm going to show you. So over 50% of the cities I examined, and Detroit represents this trend, are investing in what are called qualified census tracts. So if you've never heard of a qualified census tract, or QCT for short, it is a HUD designation of economically disadvantaged communities. And the reason for this is twofold. So remember when I said that ARPA is really, really hard and complex to wrap your arms around? In the many pages of guidance that Treasury released in mid-July, they identified that where cities are looking to quote unquote respond to the public health emergency with respect to COVID, they said you can give meaning to that term and Treasury will presume eligibility if you invest in a qualified census tract. And it's not any kind of investment. There are some parameters around this, but if you invest in families living in QCTs, particularly in providing supportive housing, vouchers, assistance relocating to neighborhoods with higher levels of economic opportunity and others, Treasury will presume eligibility. And I believe that the growth that I have seen across plans that are prioritizing investments in qualified census tracts beyond articulating a strong nexus to citywide equity outcomes really became accelerated when Treasury explicitly said this for cities who were hungry for guidance. Second trend on the slide that follows is with respect to the inclusion of nonprofit partners. Over 70% of the cities I examined are reflecting incredibly meaningful inclusion and entry points of nonprofit partners in their ARP strategies. Baltimore, Maryland, who you see here, is one example where they actually creating a public process that places nonprofits with the agency that they lend to citywide departments and others to actually propose projects from the beginning. This is incredibly powerful because
Lourdes, can I just ask you to pause for a second? We've lost the slides and it would be such a shame for you to continue without the important visuals.
Okay.
So I'm gonna ask my colleague Tracy to take a minute and see if we can get the slides back up.
Okay. My goodness, I did not even notice that. I was so engrossed in the content. So yes, happy to pause.
And if Tracy maybe has lost internet or something challenging, I'm also going to take a minute and see if I can pull up the slides that I have. Oh, looks like we are getting it back. Fabulous. Interruption over. Lourdes, please continue being your fabulous self.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the overly generous comments. But I think if we could go back one slide, just kind of briefly ending on, Baltimore, Maryland, not as the only example, but one of really including in a project prioritization process nonprofits to have agency from the beginning. If we go to the next slide, you'll see the third example that really struck me is that some cities like Cleveland, Ohio, are asking, should we and how do we raise other funds at this time, particularly from philanthropists and the private sector? And can you imagine if you're already dealing with the complexity of understanding ARPA, coming up with a process for ARPA that you didn't expect in the middle of COVID, why in the world would you be asking this question in an era where you are potentially flush with cash you did not expect? If you look at Cleveland's plan, it's incredibly thoughtful in saying, we are using this money, yes, to meet immediate needs and seed immediate processes and projects, but that's not the end of the inquiry. It is critical to begin to develop a strategy of co-investment in coordination to find other supportive funding streams. And the reason for that is, think about the importance of sustained continuity. Once you figure out the investments that are going to start to work, particularly here where you see a snapshot of how Cleveland's approaching a comprehensive neighborhood redevelopment strategy that was already existing in the city and could be enhanced with ARP funding and co-investment. We're thinking about not just core development areas that are resource rich, but also communities that are on the fringes, and really thinking about a comprehensive strategy that could align to citywide outcomes. How you continue that is going to be really important, and you are well served, even though it's really hard, to think about that from the beginning. Who are the partners that you bring in from the start from philanthropy in the private sector, and particularly how can that not just deepen the substantial injection of funding you're getting from ARP being poised for continuity, but also the ability to ideate and to think of different models of public and private sector partnerships at a time when you have the breathing room that ARP provides of having sort of that infusion of seed capital. And on the next slide, you'll see a little bit of sort of recapping other trends that I won't dive into deeply. So we've talked a lot about community engagement. Many communities are using this moment in time to also develop equity scoring frameworks that align to their existing equity practices, and making sure that they see this as an opportunity to extend this to the budget and finance realm if perhaps they have not done that before. Many cities are saying, you know, with the administrative support that you can use ARP dollars for, creating a centralized office or new positions to really manage what's going to be a multi-year and complex process of impact reporting that they've never had to do to the US Treasury. And really, again, tying impact reporting to those larger equality and equity outcomes, saying, you know, maybe we have some starting points that never have crossed the budget and finance realm. Maybe it's a time for those two worlds to meet as we think about how to integrate equity in our public finance processes, even if driven by ARP. If we go to the next slide, this is the closing question I asked myself and saying, you know, I'm leaving you with some key insights. What should you be thinking about if you're on this webinar and you're a community leader or somebody working in the nonprofit space seeking to fully leverage this opportunity alongside your city partners? And if you look at the next slide, I'll show you just a couple of those reflections. First is, I cannot stress enough, make sure that you really understand that not all cities are uniform. That is okay, and you want to meet your city where they are. Again, remember that there is a multi-tranche strategy, and that often what I believe we are going to see, given the complexity and sort of the challenge of when you expect and learn reporting from the US Treasury as you are making decisions as a city leader, is a higher degree of innovation with respect to probably the second tranche coming in May of 22. And there is still time to plan and to be a real thought partner to communities towards that end, particularly where we'll see cross-jurisdictional learning of how you thought about strategies, both spanning beyond one level of government, and how nonprofits were included as meaningful community partners in service delivery and other aspects. There's also an opportunity that I can't stress enough to build equity-informed revenue frameworks tied to ARP that then could translate to other revenue processes. So think about this as the opportunity to take what Treasury has mandated and possibly scale that across other parts of the financial realm of government decision-making. And finally, our funds are time limited. You want to make sure that even though it's difficult at some stage before 2024, you think about co-investment, because that's going to be critical to sustain continuity. And both nonprofits and philanthropists are key in that work and should really see themselves as leading partners to play a meaningful role in that conversation. And with that, I'm going to end. Happy to take questions at the appropriate stage at the end, but really I'm also as excited as all of you to hear from our leaders in Fresno.
Unmute. Thank you so much, Lourdes. I really appreciate the wisdom that you've shared with us. Also appreciate folks who are putting questions in the Q&A. We look forward to having a really robust discussion afterwards when we are able to integrate Lourdes' fabulous presentation with the insights from the panel. And now we will turn to that panel who will talk about how the American Rescue Plan is actually playing out on the ground in one city, the city of Fresno. We have Ashley Swearengin, the president and CEO of the Central Valley Community Foundation, Georgeanne White, an assistant city manager of the city of Fresno, and Jerry Yang Johnson, vice president and community relations senior consultant with Wells Fargo. So Ashley, I'll start with you. And as you know, one reason I wanted to highlight Fresno in this webinar was the DRIVE plan, on the theory that communities that had a plan in place would have kind of a head start in thinking about possibilities for equity and transformation. So can you share just a little bit about what the DRIVE plan is and how you envision that DRIVE could work alongside, leverage, be collaborative with the federal dollars that are going to land in Fresno?
Sure. And good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here with you. And I feel like Lourdes' presentation was like worth twice the price of admission. Like, that was fantastic. And I wish we could have just like said, oh, Lourdes, keep talking, because that really quality information, and appreciate your research. I think where we step in as a community in Fresno, it's a really interesting sort of case study, because in some ways we have moved leap years ahead in recent months and years on preparing our community for investment. At the same time, we are working in a community and in a region that is trying to overcome literally 60, 75, 100 years of disinvestment. And so the huge volume of dollars flowing from ARPA is both a tremendous benefit and blessing. It is also a high stress moment because for under-resourced and disinvested cities and regions, we all have this feeling of like, this is our moment and we don't want to waste it. But there are some hard truths on the ground in a community like Fresno that we can't ignore. And I want to just talk about that just a little bit, and then I'll hand back to you and the other panelists. So real quick, the answer to your question, what is the DRIVE plan? Well, you can learn more at fresnodrive.org. And it is an example of a large community group, about 300 people representing 150 organizations, public, private, civic, coming together to ask itself the question, what will it take in Fresno to finally break the back of chronic double-digit unemployment? Thanks to research from the Urban Institute, Solomon Green, who I see is on the call, we now have highlighted the fact that it's not enough to just focus on the flat economy that is harmful to everybody, but we have to drill in and realize that Fresno actually experiences the greatest racial economic disparity in all of California and almost the worst in the US. So our community came together, institutional leaders, community groups, some private actors, civic sector, and said, what is it going to take? And the interesting thing about that experience has been all of us came to the table eager to ask the question with some anticipation of the answer to that question was our right answer and what we've been working on for a long time. And we all sort of collided into this space of like, I know what will work, I know what will work, I know what will work. And as the years have unfolded, and I should also mention Shared Prosperity Partnership was really the impetus to get to the point where we launched the DRIVE initiative. So that was the precursor to get to this point. In the process of asking the question, we have learned so much about the fact that, again, for an under-resourced area, it's easy to think, oh, we know what the answer is, just throw money at something. When you don't have it, you think you should just throw money. And what I certainly have learned in this process, and this has been the clear voice from community groups, from leaders of color in Fresno, like, hey, can we just do a time out and stop thinking that what we've done for the last 25 years, if we just do more of it, that it's actually going to get us different outcomes. So DRIVE kind of yanked sort of that institutional perspective back and caused a lot of our community apparatus to say like, oh my gosh, well, we know money is a part of the solution, but there are a lot of other things we have to figure out first. So all of that to say, DRIVE landed in what we are calling an investment plan. It's a 10-year focus, about $4 billion kind of marked out for investment in 3 broad areas: economic development, neighborhood development, and then education, job training, sort of complete human capital pipeline. And I will say, I'll just land on a couple of two more points, Jennifer, then I'll hand back to you. The investment plan approach this is well before ARPA. I mean, this is 2019 we were doing this. The investment plan approach, while I appreciate community and policy voices saying it's not just about the money, for those of us who come from sort of that operational implementation perspective, I would argue like, yeah, but also the change that you aspire to, if you can't actually figure out how to land a dollar and spend it to get the outcome you want, you're not ready for investment. And so the investment plan approach has caused a sharpening and a focus and an orientation towards implementation that has built capacity in our broader civic sector. So I highly recommend it, not just for ARPA, but for overall purposes. The second thing, and I'll close on this, is when we're thinking about ARPA, oh gosh, I just realized I had a third point. So I'm gonna try to sneak it in as like a part 2 of the second point. But when you're thinking about ARPA, for like, depending on your city, those resources are going to be sprinkled across a number of agencies. So while we'll hear in a minute from Georgeanne White from the city of Fresno, they have, I think, $177 million, which, by the way, eye-popping Detroit, holy cow, $800 million. Fresno is larger than Detroit and seeing $177 million, and kudos for Detroit for figuring out how to unlock that box better. But anyway, there are piles and piles of money showing up at school districts, at counties, at all these different institutions. And so those of us in the civic sector, it's like our job to kind of figure out how to put all that together. And then, well, you know what? I lost my last point. Let me just stop with that because I'm sensitive of time, but I'm happy to take questions and react to comments in the Q&A time. So thank you very much, everybody.
Ashley, and I appreciate that you bringing up the point and Lourdes' presentation. And by the way, Lourdes, we've got lots of requests for your slides, so we will work out with you how we'll share it with the audience. That point about the money is coming into geographies through a lot of different doors, and as complicated as it is and as difficult as it may be for community to work just with the local government, that's only one option. And transformation can take place at a lot of levels. But speaking of cities, Georgeanne, people talk about the ARP dollars and other federal funds, right? Maybe at the end of the month we'll have an infrastructure bill. There's Justice $40. There's still the CARES Act. That these are like a once in a generation opportunity for cities. So can you just share, like, how is Fresno thinking about its spending, and how is it thinking about prioritizing? Ashley gave us the context. It's a historically low resource city. It's not getting one of the larger allocations. So how are you making the decisions, and where do you think it might land?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great to be here. So what I would say to that is, to offshoot of what Ashley said with regard to the drive priorities, we are focusing on neighborhoods. We've had decades of disinvestment. We've had decades of, a crumbling infrastructure within our neighborhoods. So we've really looked at what the other sources are that are coming down the pike that are very specific. So we don't want to spend these dollars, which while they have a lot of strings attached, they're a little more flexible. So we want to reserve these dollars for the things that don't have any other funding sources. So huge focus and priority of both our mayor and our city council is neighborhood infrastructure. Definitely the water, sewer, streets, curbs, gutters, just the traditional neighborhood. We've heard loud and clear for many, many years. We have neighborhoods that have third world infrastructure. Literally pavement down to the dirt. So that has been our main focus. We are one of those cities that was eagerly awaiting the rules because we wanted to make sure that we were spending in accordance with the rules, because obviously we're a city that doesn't, if we were to misspend, we don't have the resources to pay back. With the last set of interim rules coming down, we have our sketch of how we thought we wanted to spend it pending the rules coming down, which focused on infrastructure. And I think that since most of our city are qualified census tracts, at least 2/3 of our city, we'll continue down that path. We actually are beginning to solidify our plan now. We had a picture, a pie chart of where we thought it was going to go, and now we're getting into the real work of putting together more of a spending plan and starting to go through the legislative process. So we're probably about 30 days from that, probably about the time that the regulations are released. Hopefully we'll be ready to start spending those dollars. We've spent a few dollars on the things that we absolutely know are eligible expenses regarding testing and vaccines, but on the other items, and thanks to Lourdes for pointing us to the documents that have been coming from Treasury that had that qualified census tract language, that gave us a little bit more comfort that the infrastructure spending we wanted to do would be in line with what Treasury would be willing to accept. But it is definitely a once in a lifetime opportunity. $177 million into our city. Why my eyes popped out when I wrote it down, $826 million to Detroit. Like, I was Ashley's former mayor days, like, how does that it always happens, to Fresno, where we're always under resourced, but we will absolutely take the 177 million and march forward with trying to have a transformative effect on our community.
Great. Thanks so much, Georgeanne. Jerry, Ashley's really important point in the chat, right? Keep doing your long-term missed work. There will be other ways to draw down federal funds and fund community priorities if you really do a good job of engaging community residents and lifting their priorities. You have been a big part of engaging community residents, and particularly organizing around racial equity and making sure that people of color in Fresno have a greater voice and a more aligned voice in local decision making. Can you briefly describe some of that work? We've had some questions in the chat about community engagement. Can you describe some of your work and how you see it applying now that there are more opportunities for spending for federal funding flows and other funding flows in the city?
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And also I echo Ashley's comments about Lourdes' presentation, and just found it incredibly helpful just to at least have a big picture of what other cities are doing and what we have been doing. And so, you know, as part of Fresno Drive, you know, and being a community developer that's within philanthropy and within a financial institution, you know, we have to take into account the big picture of things. And so what, you know, we've done in Fresno Drive has been really intentional about thinking about real inclusive economic growth. And what does that mean? So to Ashley's point, we started this way before ARPA. We, you know, pulled together those 150 stakeholders and looked at, okay, you know, what are the things that we have to absolutely address and do? And what rose to the top of that was addressing and having a shared understanding about racism in our community and its impact to the development of our community, to economic development. And so, you know, I would say that we've been persistent in focusing on building the infrastructure of engagement, and that being absolutely critical to doing this work. You know, you can't put together a $4 billion plan, $4 billion investment plan without actually thinking about and engaging community voice in it. And we're just not going to do it. We're just not going to move forward in the ways that we've been moving forward in the past for generations, right? And so at this moment, we really see it, you know, with ARPA as a transformational moment. We've had the pandemic, we've had, you know, racial injustice that we've had to address, that it's a transformational moment. In the position that I sit in, you know, in philanthropy, in a financial institution, as a community resident who's deeply passionate about this work, I get to be at tables and push and open the door and push for and demand that we have resident voice, that we have community engagement. And so we've done a couple of things through our race equity work, through Drive as well. And I'll talk briefly about our theory of change and how we want to go about doing this, how we have and how we're planning on doing this. We want to strengthen capacity and engage and mobilize community, the communities that have long been underinvested, disinvested in, marginalized. We want to really focus on having a shared understanding of racism and its impact and how it's played out in our city. That has been critical and at the core of this. If we are not coming from the same understanding of racism and its impact, then it's going to be really hard for us to see success. And then we want to push for programmatic and policy priorities that insist on racial equity and address racial injustice. You know, Lourdes talked about co-investment and equity-informed decision-making. That's exactly what we hope to do out of our own Drive. It's not just depending and waiting on, you know, elected officials or policymakers to make change, but we are also saying everyone needs to play a role in this work and address this. And so I think that, you know, through our work, we've set the stage, we've built and are supporting the infrastructure for authentic community engagement. Our grassroots organizations and resident leaders have been doing this work for generations. And it's really time for us to invest in that, support it, and build the capacity and continue to build the capacity of it.
Great, thanks. I appreciate that. What's emerging, and certainly I saw this in other philanthropy and peer organizations, that there was, when ARP came out, right? Once in a generation, yes, that's true. But what's also true is if you spend once in a generation money poorly, it may take another generation to walk back those mistakes or those deep investments in the status quo. So I really appreciate what's coming through in this webinar, which is that there is time, right? As much as we might think, oh, we've got to move fast, we've got to act fast. The needs are great, and that's meaning vast, and that's important. But it is important also to make sure that people who have previously not been at tables are at tables, that spending is happening in a different way. And if it takes longer, if it involves the discomfort of engaging, that's worth it. Ashley, do you want to say a little bit, more about some of the things that you've put in the chat about kind of Drive operationalizing its commitment, or, kind of riff off of anything that Georgeanne and Jerry have said previously?
Well, I love chatting it up in the chat. So I was just kind of going off a little bit there. I think one thing that I think would be helpful maybe for other communities. I know we in Fresno, 2017, 2018, Shared Prosperity Partnership. A lot of talk around how do we center race equity. And I'll just speak for myself. I mean, I remember being in so many different system change meetings, whether it was K-16, trying to figure out how to operate as one system, or systematic neighborhood development, and all the words were there centering race and equity. But I found myself asking, what do people exactly mean by that? What would we do differently if we're living out that commitment? And so thankfully, Jerry and her colleagues on the Drive Race Equity Committee literally spent a year. This was the COVID year. Our first year on Zoom was both the scramble to try to respond to community needs, like everybody on this call in our own region, but also these folks were hammering away at this big sort of glorious concept. How do we actually make it touch the ground in a really practical way? And so we partnered with Dr. Elvis Frazier from Sankofa Consulting, and these guys just hammered it out. It manifests, there's actually 16 or 17 major pieces of really what I'm speaking to is Drive's theory of change. But the other items, the other 13 or 14 on the list that all contribute to what we're trying to do are, I would say, a little bit segmented, different actors doing different things. We found there were 3 things that everybody needs to be committed to, and that in doing so, it would really bring about the ecosystem sort of cultural shift that we need in community development in Fresno. So the 3 things I put in the chat, and I'll tell you, these things sound simple, but they are powerful. Every Drive actor being involved in, rooted in shared understanding and analysis, dialogue, and work. And for people who are operators of public systems or nonprofits, or even for sure private sector, it can be a little eyes roll back in the head if you go hey, you need to commit to this conversation. That sends off alarm bells from people who are we just have to do more stuff. And what we've learned is no, we're going to do the wrong stuff if we don't stop and dialogue first and try to figure out if we're on the same page. So that alone has resulted in broad sweeping changes in focus. And then just quickly, every initiative that's a part of Drive has to articulate, how are you going to build in that pathway for not just community engagement, but ultimately community leadership? We're not going to get there overnight because we don't have the infrastructure in place. I'm envious of other communities that are 10, 15, 20 years ahead. And so when ARPA shows up, the community can light up. Now, however, I will say, I will put Fresno's work to date over the last 20 years up against anyone, apples to apples. But I would say, as Jerry pointed out, we're not systematically prepared for the kind of community engagement that it's really going to take. And then lastly, the prioritization of the funding. I mean, I think a lot of folks had concerns that if we're talking $4 billion of spending over the next decade, pre-ARPA, it's possible that sort of old Fresno would be that's terrific. 3.99999 billion will go to all the stuff we've already done, and we'll get to year 9, we'll be oh, and now the race equity outcome. And so what we've said is like, look, every dollar that's being spent, like the first dollar in, the question is this impacting race equity outcomes? Yes, no. And it's not that every part of that dollar is the direct connect, but being very intentional about every dollar in being aimed at our race equity outcomes.
Great, thank you. This will be a bit of a lightning round because I do want to get to the questions. But Georgeanne, aside from Treasury guidance, the final guidance, you have a lot of people on this call who are from research and public policy institutions, the nonprofit sector. What would help you feel like you were making really good decisions, again, aside from the Treasury guidance, with this money? What kind of support do you need from a larger ecosystem when it comes to not just ARP, but other federal funds?
Well, I think the ability to leverage other resources, just like with any funding source coming through, we don't have the luxury of looking at this as the silver bullet. So we've always had to look at layering resources, and there's, whether it be nonprofits or foundations or other community partners, that has always been helpful, because we don't always know in city government. We're so focused on providing the basic city services, just the simple things like, water coming out of the faucet, police, fire, that sometimes we don't put our heads up enough to be able to look at the other human and community infrastructure around us. So when we participate in Drive, we participate in other efforts, but sometimes it just takes like people outreaching to us, and obviously Ashley has set a lot of foundation for the interaction with other partners into coming into Fresno, but reaching out to us saying, hey, we heard that you're working on this project or something. Is that something that you might be interested in partnering with us on, or how can we be helpful? Or hey, we worked with this other city and they were able to do this. We love the idea of not reinventing the wheel and stealing great ideas from other communities. I mean, I think our city has done that very successfully for many, many years. We come up with our own great ideas, but it's also great to take information from other areas. So I think, the ability to leverage, I mean, we have to leverage, because we're never going to have enough, and not just talking money, I'm talking brain power, talking, other community resources that can help us be as impactful as possible.
Great. And Jerry, a question for you. What would success, or what, not would, I'm not going to make it a condition, I'm going to say will. What will success look like in Fresno? How will you know that you have made the strides that you want to make in how resources are allocated and how communities are able to show up?
Well, I would say that I often use my parents as examples, as immigrants, as refugees to this country, who benefited greatly from community services, and also are monolingual, and most of their lives in the US were in the fields working. And so I often think, success for me would be to see them be able to in this process, feel that they can engage in the process, that they have a voice at the table, that when my dad has a concern about an empty lot in his neighborhood, that he knows exactly where to go to get those answers, and that he can actually engage in transforming his own neighborhood, and feeling safe and feeling whole. And so I think, to me, I would say I think about people like my parents across our city, and how they, are engaged in the process, how they get to design their own communities, how they get to have a say in what happens to their own families and within their own neighborhoods as well.
Great, thank you. Lourdes, I'm going to put you on the spot here and ask if the panel discussion has highlighted anything that particularly resonates with you, or that you see as plugging into some of the larger themes from your presentation? Or is there anything that you want to add or summarize as before we go into the broader Q&A?
I think, so many great comments from our leaders on the panel. And I think one point that really was striking is even hearing about the Drive initiative. This is a great example to some of the questions that have come up in the chat of, there's an existing investment strategy and plan, and regardless of its stage, whether nascent, implemented across different projects, it still creates a framework in how to think about equity and investing. And one of the key things that I see in many cities is there is some version of Drive at some level where there is a commitment to citywide outcomes and equity. And often if you think, what could be the extension of taking those principles and applying them in an ARP context can create efficiency, scale, and alignment across even the way that the city has been thinking about equity as a process in one context to reach equitable outcomes in another. So that, there's so many other nuggets. You could have a whole nother hour on this, but I just agree wholeheartedly with every perspective shared, and including also the frustration of, what it must mean to make decisions around this, where guidance is still forthcoming, is not an insignificant thing. That I think we want to know as a context that cities are also a challenge that's very real.
Great, thank you. Just to let you know, I'm going to be looking at my other screen. I'm not looking at Instagram or my email. That's where I have the questions box open. So that's why you'll see me pivoting a little bit. From Tricia Finnegan from the Louisville Community Foundation, she asks, I would appreciate learning of successful tactics to increase community power in the process of influencing or approving funding distribution locally. Jerry and Ashley, what has worked in Fresno? Again, maybe not specifically around ARPA, but what are how is community engagement different? Ashley, you mentioned community engagement is not me showing up at the table and saying, I have the best idea. How is it going differently? Ashley, I'll start with you and then Jerry.
I wish you were going to say, Jerry, I'll start with you.
I can start with Jerry. No, Jerry's like, nope, Ashley.
Okay, well, she's like, I have another full-time job, Ashley. Like, this is you and your team. Can you please, get the Community Foundation is backbone for Drive, and so we are scrambling to keep up with leaders that are helping us, figure out how to support this. But anyway, our team. Okay, how are we going about it differently? Adopting the transformative community engagement framework was big, and that happened in October of last year. Yeah, that's right. And I feel like that's probably been circulating for decades, but it's just it landed at the right time in our community where and I come from, prior to being at the Community Foundation in a public sector world where things are very controlled and public meeting it's hard to manage the services that a government agency delivers. It's hard to use those dollars in a transformative way. And I think I certainly came from the perspective of okay, check the box on the public meeting, we've done engagement. And so having a real practical tool of 0 to 5, whatever, that has been very useful. So apologies if that seems basic to some of you, but again, I'm just telling you from a former kind of academic and then government background, it's not obvious to many key managers and leaders in the public sector. So that's been really useful. And then as we've applied that tool to each of our Drive initiatives and said hey, you may not have been thinking about this, but you ultimately over the next 3 or 4 years, you need to figure out what is the leadership pipeline for residents who are experiencing your services or your interventions. What's your plan for say 3 years from now for them to be leading this effort and the institutions to be taking a back seat to supporting that resident leadership. That has really just caused civic actors and public agencies to go, oh my God, is that what you mean? Okay, well, let's go figure that out. So we have right now our Cradle to Career Partnership, for example, has convened a community congress. It's a 100-person resident group that is speaking into 0 to 5 interventions. We have a signature effort of the Drive initiative is dedicated neighborhood hubs, where our goal is to be in half of the concentrated poverty neighborhoods in Fresno in the next 10 years, where there's dedicated staff hired from the neighborhood who are leading the engagement. And there's just instead of having to go from grant to grant, we figure out a way to permanently pay for and sustain that sort of resident leadership. So they are plug and play, like whatever issue may come, whatever opportunity may come, we've built in this network of people who are engaged in helping to connect those opportunities to residents.
Great. And I will add, however an individual city is planning to allocate the money, I believe, and Lourdes will correct me, that community capacity building is at least at some level an allowed use of ARP dollars. So folks who may want to use that information in their city context, the legislation, again, pending the final rule, is on your side. Jerry, what's different now? What's more robust?
Well, I would just say that I would also just add that, and Ashley covered it really well, that two things. The resources that have already come into Fresno Drive, we have focused a lot of those resources on building the capacity of the organizations on the ground for community engagement. Secondly, one of the things that I would just add about to Ashley's point is that we've built the 150 stakeholders means that there's 150 people or more, 300 people actually, that we're connected to each other now. And one of the tactics and ways in which we've utilized the space is to call upon each other, to actually, in a sense, have those uncomfortable conversations and pull each other out and say, hey, let's rethink this, or maybe you need to hear from someone who actually lives in the neighborhood or is experiencing this to make the change, to design your programming, to figure out where those resources go. And so that has been really transformational, and that has been one of the highlights of the work in Fresno Drive.
Great, thank you. Lourdes, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to piggyback a couple of different questions. One is, and you may have answered this in the chat and I missed it, can you provide some more information on what you mean by the opportunity to build equity-informed revenue and expenditure frameworks, and what examples might you highlight from there? I'm going to piggyback that with a question from Martha Fedorowicz of the Urban Institute, which is, are cities using ARPA funds, as far as you can tell, to make internal organizational changes, new systems or processes, new departments, new technology, or staff training?
Two great questions, super quick answers. And one is answered in the chat. On equity-informed frameworks, think about the fact that ARP is a federal program that elevates equity as a value and actually creates a reporting framework around that. So you have to say, how are place-based outcomes changing? If this is your first experience as a city, don't let it end here, is sort of my advice. Think about how embedding equity principles and how you budget and how you think about the outcomes you want from that process, and also how you raise money, and even how you think about bringing investments, can also reflect equity values and be really meaningful. And I included in the chat an example of, like, the city of San Antonio is just one of many cities, was a budgeting for equity approach that they publish on their website and say, this is how we do it. It might not be perfect or suited to your context, but it's one of many. The NLC Real Initiative has a database of communities that are committed to this practice. Government Alliance on Race and Equity, I know there's also another program from Bloomberg Philanthropies that I included in the chat that I'm a part of that is focused on this value and helping cities advance around it. So many examples, and I can include others. On the second question, I am seeing cities who at least are committed to saying we need a framework of administration or devoting resources is allowed in the act, in the ARP context. And I can't imagine that coupling that with a knowledge management framework so that you don't lose the ability, what you are learning through this process, if you want to extend these principles to other areas of budget and finance, is something that would be highly valuable and enabled. I think over time we will see that if that extension happens, or sort of the knowledge sharing of what the administrative process is created here, whether they extend to other realms of budget and finance, and even both, grant making or the receiving of grants and pursuing them from the federal government and from private sector sources as well.
Great. I wish we could go on. I had more questions for the panelists. We only got to a very small number of the questions that we had. It turns out an hour just flies by when you have such brilliant women and such an important topic. I'm so grateful to Lourdes, Ashley, Georgeanne, and Jerry for sharing their wisdom and insights, and for all of you who have spent time really lighting up the chat and having a great discussion amongst yourselves in the chat. We are investigating whether we will be able to share a chat transcript. And again, we'll also talk to Lourdes about sharing the slides. So you will be hearing from us again with a link to the recording. And with an invitation to register for our next webinar in the series, which will be at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Mountain, and 12 p.m. Pacific. Just wanted to be geographically inclusive, on October 26th. And it will feature our friends from the Urban Institute and a couple of city leaders talking about how they can track local government allocations for spending ARP funds and some other federal funds, and also how this once-in-a-generation moment compares to our last once-in-a-generation moment, the 2008-2009 Recovery Act. So again, really appreciate the panelists, really appreciate you taking the time today, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar and throughout the series as we learn together about how to make this moment genuinely transformational. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.